The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker is one of my favorite games ever, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel like there was something missing. It's an amazing adventure, but it feels just a little bit shy of being a masterpiece. Due to the game's rushed development, we eventually learned that, sure enough, at least 2 dungeons were cut from the final game. In this video, we will investigate what dungeons were possibly cut from The Wind Waker. Following the release of The Wind Waker HD on Wii U in 2013, series director Eiji Aonuma was interviewed by IGN.com. In this interview, Aonuma made an interesting statement that caused the imaginations of many Zelda fans to run wild. The IGN article stated the following: "Despite the fact that it was originally partially unfinished, rushed towards release, Aonuma's team was forced to cut 2 dungeons from The Wind Waker, replacing them with a trawl for bits of Triforce that was not well loved at the time. I had hoped those 2 dungeons might be reinstated for the HD release, but it turns out that was never a possibility. I'm aware that lots of users wanted those 2 missing dungeons to be implemented in Wind Waker HD, but to be honest, we've already used those 2 dungeons for other titles after Wind Waker already," says Aonuma, laughing. "So right now, technically, they don't really exist anymore." Where those dungeons ended up is one of the great Zelda mysteries. Though they were never transplanted in their entirety, we didn't exactly use them as is and implement them in another game, clarifies Aonuma. We'd add some of their features to other dungeons, so they're in different dungeons now. Elements of them must have found a way into Twilight Princess and Phantom Hourglass, but who knows, their remnants may be somewhere in Skyward Sword too. With that statement in mind, let's take a look at the possible clues within not only The Wind Waker, but the titles that followed to see if we can figure out what the missing Wind Waker dungeons were. One of the prime suspects for a missing dungeon is usually associated with Jabun and Nehru's Pearl. This is due to it falling in line with the pattern of the previous 2 dungeons. Dragon Roost Cavern is linked to the spirit Valu that awards you with Din's Pearl. The Forbidden Woods dungeon is linked to the Great Deku Tree, the forest spirit, and awards you for Roar's Pearl. So naturally, many felt that if there was a dungeon cut, it would have been Jabun's dungeon. This certainly makes sense. If the dungeon were to have happened, it likely would have been at Jabun's home of Great Fish Isle. Many believe it would have been a callback to Ocarina of Time's Jabu Jabu's Belly dungeon, where we would go inside Jabun for the actual dungeon. There is even some unused voice clips and a swimming animation that were unused for Jabun. Another supporting factor for this is the Triforce map inside of Tetra's cabin on the pirate ship. It links Dragon Roost, Forest Haven, and Great Fish Isle along with the Triangle Islands in the middle to create a symbol of the Triforce, with the Tower of the Gods in the middle. Despite a pretty substantial amount of evidence, I still have my doubts if Jabun or Nehru's Pearl was ever intended to have a dungeon. First, in basically every Zelda game where you obtain the Master Sword, there is 3 proper dungeons preceding it. We have this in A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess. Skyward Sword is a little bit of a different case, given that it's about crafting the legendary blade itself. But this is no different in The Wind Waker. Even though we don't have a dungeon to get Nehru's Pearl, we still have a 3rd dungeon in the Tower of the Gods. Next, though not a direct quote from Aonuma himself, in the IGN interview, it stated the following: "Aonuma's team was forced to cut 2 dungeons from Wind Waker, replacing them with a trawl for bits of Triforce that was not well loved at the time. If this quote is to be believed, it's clearly implying that the 2 missing dungeons would be after you obtain the Master Sword, which would make it impossible to be a Jabun or Nehru Pearl related dungeon." Finally, Wind Waker originally released in late 2002 to early 2003, depending on what region you lived in. This was only 5 or so years after Ocarina of Time and 1 year after Oracle of Ages. I bring this up because both of those games featured a dungeon called Inside Jabu Jabu's Belly. It would surprise me if Nintendo would want to retread that dungeon idea yet again in such a short span of time. I know Nintendo wasn't as directly involved with Oracle of Ages as Capcom developed it, but they were clearly aware of all the contents that the game would have. On Link's quest in the Wind Waker, he must get both the Power Bracelet and Iron Boots to enter the Earth Temple and Wind Temple respectively. To get these items, Link must complete the Fire Mountain and Ice Ring Isle mini-dungeons. It's possible that both of these mini-dungeons that award a key item were meant to be full-fledged dungeons. While it's certainly possible that Ice Ring Isle was meant to be a full dungeon, there's not a ton of evidence to go off of. Circling back to the IGN article, it mentions that elements likely ended up in Twilight Princess and Phantom Hourglass. Both Phantom Hourglass and Twilight Princess have ice dungeons, so it is possible that if Wind Waker was meant to have an ice dungeon, some ideas ended up in Phantom Hourglass's Temple of Ice and Twilight Princess's Snow Peak Ruins. When talking about Fire Mountain, we have much more evidence to go off of it originally being a dungeon. Hyrule Historia shows concept art for an unused island called Stovepipe Island, an island of steam and smoke. Smoke can be seen flowing from the top of the mountain, where it has text saying "Enter from here," much like Link does in Wind Waker's Fire Mountain. The island included a lot of pipes, a village, and a hot spring lake. There is concept art of what one would guess is the island inhabitants, with the quote, "Everyone likes tobacco." Interestingly, these inhabitants look quite similar to Gorons, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. In Ocarina of Time, the prequel to the Wind Waker for the adult timeline, Link receives both spiritual stones and medallions from the Kokiri, the Zora, and the Gorons. In the Wind Waker, for late game dungeons, Link teams up with Medli the Rito in the Earth Temple, Medli being an evolved form of the Zora, and Makar in the Wind Temple, with Makar being of Kokiri descent. It would make sense that Link would also work with some evolved form of a Goron for a third late game dungeon. Remnants of this idea were very clearly used in Twilight Princess. The Goron Mines has a lot of similarities to Stovepipe Island, including a hot spring lake and many pipes with steam and smoke. The Goron design even looks somewhat close to the Wind Waker concept art, especially Gor Amato, who you meet inside of Goron Mines, who no doubt was inspired by the concept art, with smokestacks on his head and more going down his back. But it doesn't end here. Clearly, IGN pointing to Phantom Hourglass also has some merit. In the Wind Waker, in the 2 late game dungeons, you use the command melody to control your sidekick character. You control Medli in the Earth Temple and Makar in the Wind Temple. This is quite similar to Phantom Hourglass's Goron Temple. Inside the dungeon, there is a section where you control a sidekick character, which just so happens to be a Goron. Together, you and your Goron partner, Gon Goron, work together to solve puzzles much in a similar way to the Wind Waker's dungeon puzzles. So while the majority of Stovepipe Island's dungeon concepts ended up in Twilight Princess, I am confident at least part of it ended up in Phantom Hourglass. In the Wind Waker, there is a great deal of importance put on the Ghost Ship, including a map to figure out where and when it appears. Once you actually enter the ship, it ends up being a disappointment, as it is a one-room mini-dungeon to help complete the Triforce Piece quest. Personally, it feels like there should have been a lot more to the Ghost Ship. Interestingly, in Phantom Hourglass, there is much more importance put on the Ghost Ship, including it being a dungeon in the game. It wouldn't surprise me at all if the Ghost Ship was originally intended to be a full-fledged dungeon in the Wind Waker. What do you think are the most likely candidates for Wind Waker's 2 missing dungeons? Jabun, an ice dungeon, Stovepipe Island, and/or the Ghost Ship? Personally, I feel Stovepipe Island and the Ghost Ship are the most likely. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.